We don't take an oath to a country. We don't take an oath to a tribe. We don't take an oath to a religion. We don't take an oath to a king or a queen or to a tyrant or a dictator. And we don't take an oath to a wannabe dictator.
That was a former chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, last fall taking a shot at Donald Trump during Milley's farewell address. This week, we're learning from new reporting by Bob Woodward that Milley is afraid of being court-martialed if Donald Trump wins re-election in 25 days. According to Woodward, Milley said, "Trump is the most dangerous person ever. I had suspicions when I talked to you about his mental decline and so forth, but now I realized he's a total fascist. He is now the most dangerous person to this country, a fascist to the core." Back with me are Charlie Sykes, Susan Glasser, and McKay Coppins. Susan, Mark Milley speaking in no uncertain terms about the true danger of Donald Trump. He's a fascist to the core. The same week that Bob Woodward is reporting that Donald Trump is having regular phone calls with Vladimir Putin, maybe as many as 7 private calls, and that Trump sent Russia COVID-19 tests when they were scarce and very much in need here in the United States. What is your reaction to these pieces of reporting?
You know, Alex, the truth is that one of the most remarkable things about Trump's presidency was his very, very consistent preference for America's adversaries over America's allies. And, while I can't confirm Bob's specific reporting here about General Milley, it certainly is consistent with concerns that he raised throughout his time observing President Trump. He was appointed to be chairman of the Joint Chiefs by President Trump. He considered resigning office after he participated in the ill-advised Lafayette Square photo op. Remember that? And he felt that he had, made a terrible mistake. He wrote a letter of resignation, which we obtained and published in our book, The Divider, in which he expressed themes that are really consistent with the idea of Trump as an un-American leader. He wrote in that letter that he believed that Donald Trump did not subscribe to the very values that America fought for in World War II, and that he really had a preference for America's adversaries in a way that was undermining this country from within. And I think that the other thing that's important to know about Milley is that he's a real student of history, in particular of World War II. And so if he's using terms like fascist, this is somebody who, this is what other people, they go play tennis to, in their spare time. General Milley, in my observation, reads big books about World War II history. And so to me, hearing that comment is very much informed by, his own study of that conflict and his own up-close observation of Donald Trump in the Oval Office.
Yeah, McKay, I sense real fear in Milley expressing that he's worried about being court-martialed, and even in his fear, there's fear at the heart of saying that the man who might be president is a total fascist to the core. And it feels like other people people who have come out against Donald Trump are afraid of him. I mean, I think there's your reporting, that Romney is also concerned about Trump going after him. I think he has shown by his prior actions that you can take him at his word. Romney told me, his voice suddenly subdued. So I would take him at his word. I mean, talk to me about that tone of voice and what you're hearing in Romney as it pertains to fear.
Yeah, that moment happened in a conversation I had with him earlier this year when I kind of asked him point blank, what do you think it'll mean for you and your life and your family if Donald Trump is reelected, given his promise of retribution against his political enemies? And he at first kind of tried to demur, and he said, well, I don't know. But once I really got him talking about him and pressed him on it, he kind of admitted, look, I've got 25 grandkids. I've got five sons, 5 daughters-in-law. We have a big family. I don't know how to protect them in a situation where you have a president who is trying to use the levers of the federal government to punish his political enemies. And I thought that was a really striking moment. Now, he's not the only one. And one of the most striking things in reporting this book, in talking to him and various other people in the Senate, was just how large the fear of political violence from Trump supporters looms in the psychology of a lot of elected Republicans. Romney told me about multiple Republicans he spoke to who chose not to vote for Trump's impeachment or conviction in the second trial because they were afraid of violence from Trump supporters. So it's not just Trump himself and the power that he can wield as president. It's the culture he's created among the most extreme segment of his base and the permission he's given them to use violence as a mechanism to achieve their aims.
Yeah, Charlie, McKay zeroes in on something that I think it's really worth talking about, which is the disconnect between Trump and violence and Trump supporters and violence. Sarah Longwell, who I know you know from the Bulwark, discovered in her focus groups that Trump basically gets a pass on his violent rhetoric. Despite refusing to abide by the results of the 2020 election, flirting with dictators, and vowing to use the government to go after his personal and political opponents, voters still perceive Trump as jokey and relatively harmless. They don't see him as a dictator threat. Charlie, do you have a working theory about how in these Trump supporters' minds or Trump voters' minds, there is just a cleave between the man and the sort of violent behavior and rhetoric and posture his supporters adopt at his behest?
Well, I think it's that rationalization that it's just Trump being Trump, that he's kind of clown-like and he just says things and it doesn't matter, which is why I think it is such an urgent moment for people like General Milley and others in the national security apparatus to sound the alarm, to say that this is who he is. This is what he's capable of doing. It's not simply theoretical anymore. The January 6th attack was a violent attack, and I'm increasingly fearful that it was more of a rehearsal than a standalone event. This is why it is so important, I think, for the people who see the danger to have the courage to speak out. Because if you don't do it right now, it will be too late later, when you are in the room. That this is the moment to say, this is what he's doing. Like, for example, when he talks about retribution, you may have people in focus groups saying, well, he doesn't actually mean it. Well, what we've seen from reporting in the New York Times relatively recently is all of the times that he has tried to use the power of government to go after and harass and investigate and indict his opponents. This is not something new. It's been documented. It's documented in Susan's book. It's been documented over and over again that it's not just Trump being Trump, that the danger is real. So this story about Mark Milley is the kind of thing that we need to step back and say, do you understand the gravity of what he is saying and what voters need to know in the next 25 days? Because if Donald Trump gets back into power, it'll be too late then to sound that alarm.